There's one detail about the Necrons that I think gets lost in most videos about them, and it's the thing that makes the whole faction work for me. When they start waking up in the 41st millennium and tearing through Imperial worlds, they aren't some new threat that appeared out of nowhere. They're survivors. They fought a war that lasted longer than our entire species has existed. They won it, and by the time it ended, there was almost nothing left that was worth winning. That war is the war in heaven, and to make sense of it, you have to go back roughly 60 million years, which is far enough back that even in the 41st millennium, nobody has a complete account of what happened. What people have are fragments, old Aeldari records, things the Necrons themselves remember and don't always agree on, and stories that have been retold so many times that calling them history is being generous. I love that about this part of the setting. The deeper you go, the better the story gets, and the less certain any of it becomes, until you hit a point where the only honest answer is that we don't really know. The Old Ones are the best example of that. They were one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations the galaxy ever produced, and yet we know far more about the things they left behind than about the Old Ones themselves. Nobody can tell you where they came from. There's no reliable description of what they actually looked like, and there's certainly no neat history of their civilization sitting in an archive somewhere waiting to be read. What we do know is that they operated on a level nothing since has matched. They understood the warp in a way later civilizations could barely approach, and out of that understanding came the Webway, a network of passages running through the Imperium that let them cross the galaxy without ever exposing themselves to the warp the way everyone after them has to. And if you're trying to hold a galaxy together, that's everything. You reinforce a world on the far side of the galaxy in the time it takes your enemy to plan the journey. You avoid the fights you don't want, and you show up in places where nobody can work out how you got there. But the Old Ones weren't just moving through the galaxy, they were shaping it. The younger species owe their existence to them. The Aeldari are the obvious example, and the Krork, the ancestors of the orcs, are another. How much of that was creation in a literal sense, and how much was engineering or guidance, isn't something the sources agree on, and I'd be making things up if I told you otherwise. That vagueness is exactly why they work, at least for me. They don't feel like a faction with a documented beginning and end. They feel like something buried underneath the whole history of the galaxy, so that whichever thread you pull on, you eventually find them at the other end of it. You find something they built, or a species they made, or a war that only happened because of a decision they took. 60 million years later, the galaxy is still dealing with the consequences, and almost nobody left alive has any idea who's responsible. And somewhere in all of that, the Old Ones ran into the Necrontyr. Now, the Necrontyr were not primitives when this happened. They had dynasties, serious technology, and an empire that had spread well beyond their homeworld. Building an empire was never their problem. Their problem was that none of them lived long enough to enjoy it. Their homeworld sat under a dying star that filled everything with hard radiation, and their bodies paid for it. Disease, decay, lifespans so short that death wasn't something you started worrying about in old age. You grew up with it. You watched your parents go. You watched your friends go. And you understood fairly early that you'd be lying there yourself before very long. When that happens to every generation without exception, it stops being a medical problem. It becomes the culture. Their cities were built around the dead. Their rulers raised tombs the way other civilizations raise monuments, and the whole species organized itself around an ending it couldn't do anything about. They tried, obviously. They went after their own biology from every direction they could think of, and none of it touched the actual problem. So eventually they looked outward instead. They pushed further into the stars, expanding an empire they'd never live to see finished. And out there, they found the Old Ones. Put yourself in their position for a second. You've spent your whole recorded history watching your own people die young. You've thrown everything your civilization has at the problem and got nowhere. And then you meet somebody who appears to have solved it before your species even existed. The Old Ones live on timescales the Necrontyr can't meaningfully picture. They understand the universe at a level the Necrontyr can't reproduce. And for the first time, there is something standing in front of them that looks like an answer. So they asked. And the Old Ones said no. The lore is clear that the request happened and clear that it was refused. What it doesn't give us is a reliable account of the reasoning, and rather than invent one, I'll just tell you where I land. I lean toward the unglamorous explanation. The Old Ones looked at an ambitious, expanding, heavily armed civilization that wanted the one thing capable of making it permanent, and decided that was a bad idea. That's not cruelty, that's a risk assessment. And given how the next few million years went, I'd say it was simultaneously the most reasonable decision anybody in this story ever made, and possibly the worst. Because from where the Necrontyr were standing, the reasoning didn't matter at all. They had found beings who held the answer to the only question their species had ever really asked. They had asked for it politely, and they had been turned away. That kind of thing doesn't fade. It just sits there and turns into something else. They weren't in a great position to be nursing a grudge either, because the Necrontyr were already fighting each other. Their empire had grown huge, and empires that size tend to produce powerful people who'd rather run their own affairs than take orders. The dynasties drifted. Some of them broke from the Triarch outright, and the result was the First War of Secession. And the order matters here because that happened before the war against the Old Ones, not after it. So picture the situation the Triarch was in. Your species is dying at the same rate it always has. Your dynasties are pulling apart. You've just been refused the one thing that might have justified the whole project. And you need something that makes all of these people stand in the same direction again. They found it. The Old Ones became the enemy that held the Necrontyr together. That's the detail that changes how you read the whole war, at least for me. The Necrontyr didn't go into this as some unified ancient superpower with a grand plan. They went into it as a fractured empire using a war to paper over problems it couldn't solve at home. The dynasties came back not because they trusted each other again, but because they'd been given somebody else to hate. And for a while that was enough. Whether they thought they could win, I don't know. They had the size for it, they had the technology, and for the first time in a long while, every dynasty was pointed in the same direction. What they didn't have was any answer to the Webway. The Old Ones could reinforce a world the moment it came under threat, decline any engagement that didn't suit them, and arrive somewhere the Necrontyr had no reason to expect them. The Necrontyr could take worlds. They could win battles. They just couldn't turn any of it into a war they were winning, because the enemy was never where the map said they should be. So they got pushed back. And then they got pushed back faster. There's a bitterness in that which I don't think the Necrontyr ever really recovered from. They had started a war because they wanted to stop dying, and the war was now killing them faster than their own biology had managed. Then the thing that always happens to fragile alliances happened. When you're winning, the old arguments inside your own empire can wait. When you're losing, they come back within about a week. The dynasties fractured again. The Second War of Secession broke out while the Necrontyr were already being driven back, and by the end of it, the older accounts described them as barely even a serious problem for the Old Ones anymore. An irritation. A war that used to matter. So look at where they are. The Empire's divided, the war's lost, their people are still dying on the same schedule they always did, and immortality is further away than it was on the day they asked for it. At that point, I don't think you need much imagination to work out why they went looking for something else. They'd tried science and it hadn't worked. They'd tried war and that had gone even worse. So they turned back toward the stars, looking for anything at all. And they found something out there that was listening. The C'tan. Even the discovery isn't clean. There are different accounts of how the Necrontyr came across the C'tan in the first place. And one of the older traditions suggests it wasn't really a discovery at all. That the sheer hatred coming off this dying civilization is what drew the C'tan toward them. Which, knowing how this ends, is a great little detail, and I'd like that to be the real version. What's consistent across the accounts is what they found. Entities of enormous energy that fed on stars, old beyond any useful measurement, and completely unable to do anything meaningful in the material universe because they had no bodies. This part gets skipped over a lot. The Necrontyr didn't fall to their knees. They looked at these things and saw a resource. So they built them bodies out of necrodermis, living metal capable of holding that kind of energy, and handed them the one thing they'd been missing, which was the ability to touch the physical world. One of them ended up known as the Deceiver, which, at some point somebody in that civilization must have heard the name and had a bad afternoon about it. The being called the Deceiver turns up right as your empire is collapsing, and offers you exactly what you've always wanted. I'd like to think I'd ask a follow-up question, but that's easy for me to say, sitting 60 million years away from it. The Necrontyr had a broken empire, a lost war, and generations of people who died at roughly 40 for no better reason than the star they'd been born under. When something arrives offering not just victory, but an end to all of it, I don't think the name on the box slows anybody down. The accounts describe the Deceiver dealing directly with Szarekh, the Silent King, and the offer was both things at once: the power to break the Old Ones, and the immortality the Necrontyr had wanted since before they had a written history. I can follow Szarekh's reasoning here, which is more than I can say for most rulers in this setting. You're responsible for an entire species. You've watched it lose a war you authorized. You've watched your own dynasties tear the empire apart twice. And somebody tells you there's a way to save all of it? I don't think that reads as temptation from where he was standing. It reads as the job. The process was called Biotransference, and stated plainly, it sounds close to perfect. The Necrontyr leave their failing biological bodies behind. They're given bodies of living metal instead. No more disease, no more radiation, nobody dying at 40. Death stops being part of the deal. After everything I've just told you about how these people lived, I can't blame them for saying yes. If your entire cultural memory is funerals, and something finally tells you it doesn't have to be, yeah. I know what I'd want to believe. The Necrontyr went into the Great Furnaces. Their biological bodies were destroyed, their minds were carried over into living metal, and the C'tan fed on everything that got stripped away in the process. How willingly all of them went is one of those points where the ancient accounts contradict each other, so I'm not going to pretend I can tell you what every dynasty experienced that day. The result isn't ambiguous though. The Necrontyr stopped existing. The Necrons began. This is the part I find tragic rather than just grim. The ordinary Necrons lost almost everything that made them people. Emotion gone. Memory damaged past repair. What came out of the furnaces were the silent, tireless warriors we know. and they weren't going to get any of it back. The higher ranks kept more. Overlords and cryptechs held on to intelligence and personality, but even they were locked inside command protocols, and they were owned outright by the C'tan, so they got it. Immortality. What they got instead was a second kind of death, the kind that leaves the body walking around afterwards. The civilization survived. The Empire survived. Almost everything that made those lives worth extending did not. That's how I read it. The events are canon, the meaning I'm putting on them is mine, and if you read it differently, I'd like to hear it, because this is the kind of thing I enjoy arguing about. The facts can be completely settled, and the meaning still be up for grabs. Quick thing before we get to what the Necrons did with their new army. If this is the kind of lore video you like, where I'm not just reading you the timeline but telling you how I actually read it, then a like helps more than you'd think. And subscribe if you want the rest of this story. That's it. Back to the war. Because the Necrontyr now had something nobody in the galaxy had ever had to fight before. An army that doesn't die. The Necrons came back to a war they'd been losing for centuries. Except now, they didn't tire, didn't sicken, didn't need to be fed or housed or replaced. And they had the C'tan behind them. Every advantage the Old Ones had built up assumed an enemy with limits. That enemy no longer existed. So the balance broke, and the scale of what followed is hard to picture properly. Worlds destroyed. Entire species that had barely started their own history removed from it. The C'tan feeding directly on stars, which is the kind of thing that only survives as a legend because nobody who watched it up close was around afterwards to describe it properly. The Old Ones needed help, and they went to the species they had shaped for it. The Aeldari above all, and the Krork alongside them. And the Krork, by the way, were not a joke at this point. Whatever you think of their descendants, the Old Ones built them as a weapon, and they worked as one. But the Aeldari gave the Old Ones something the Necrons had no equivalent for: psychic power. And the accounts describe that dependence growing as the war got worse. Which is where I think the war in heaven turns into something bigger than a very large war. Because all of this was pouring into the warp. You've got civilizations dying by the billion, psychers being used as weapons on a scale nobody has ever attempted before or since, and generation after generation of violence and terror feeding into the Imperium. Something was going to come out of that. What came out, among other things, were the Enslavers. Warp entities that reach into real space through psychic minds and use them as a door. Now, you'll sometimes see this flattened into a neat line. The Old Ones made psychic species, therefore the Old Ones made chaos. I don't buy that, and I'd push back on anybody who says it that confidently. The lore is far messier, the timescales are far longer, and chaos doesn't have a single clean origin you can pin on one civilization's decision. What I will say is that the irony here is hard to ignore. The Old Ones leaned harder on psychic races because they needed to survive the war, and the war itself was making the warp more dangerous. Whether they saw where that was heading, my guess is they underestimated it. Not out of stupidity, obviously, but because when your civilization is fighting for its life, you deal with the problem in front of you. You don't stop halfway through a collapse and ask what any of it is going to do to the galaxy in 60 million years. And then it stopped being a war anybody could win. The Enslaver Plague is the part that gets left out of the short version, and it's the part that actually explains the ending. These things spread through psychic minds, and the galaxy at that moment was full of them. Worlds went dark. Populations were turned into gateways for something that had no interest in territory or victory conditions. The younger races were gutted. Old Ones' strongholds fell one after another, and their empire came apart under the weight of a catastrophe they had helped create and could no longer steer. The Old Ones disappeared as a power in the galaxy. What happened to the last of them isn't clear, and honestly I'm glad about that, because they work far better as something ancient and half-mythical than they would as a civilization with a documented final stand and a date attached. What matters is that they were gone. So the Necrons had won. They'd achieved what the Necrontyr set out to do 60 million years earlier, and the enemy that refused their ancestors' immortality had been erased from the galaxy. And it was worth almost nothing. The galaxy they'd won was burning. The Plague didn't care that the war was over. It kept spreading, because there were still mines to spread through. Victory just meant they were the ones still standing in the wreckage. And that's when Szarekh finally looked at what he'd actually done to his own people. His species had escaped death. It had not escaped ownership. The C'tan hadn't rescued the Necrontyr, they'd farmed them. They'd taken the biological essence of an entire civilization as payment, and what they'd left behind was a machine army that couldn't disobey them. Szarekh had traded his people's mortality for their freedom, and got the paperwork wrong in the worst possible way. So the Necrons turned on their own gods. They couldn't destroy the C'tan outright. These are beings that eat stars, and you don't kill something like that with a better gun. So they broke them instead. The C'tan were shattered into fragments, and those fragments were bound, imprisoned, and eventually carried around as weapons. I do like the symmetry of it. The Necrontyr built bodies for the C'tan because they thought they could use them. The C'tan used the Necrontyr. Then the Necrons did it right back and turned what was left of the star gods into ordnance. Everybody in this story gets exactly what they inflicted on somebody else, which is about as close to justice as 40,000 ever gets. But there wasn't much left to rule by then. The Old Ones were gone, the Necrontyr were gone in every way that counted, the C'tan were in pieces, the galaxy was crawling with enslavers, and the Necrons had been at war so long that even they had run out of reasons to keep going. They could have carried on fighting whatever was left. Instead, Szarekh chose to wait. The dynasties withdrew to their tomb worlds and went into stasis. Partly because the galaxy had become unlivable, and partly because waiting costs an immortal species nothing. Let the plague burn itself out. Let the younger races crawl back, build, and exhaust themselves fighting each other. Then wake up and take a galaxy that's too tired to argue. The Great Sleep would run for around 60 million years. 60 million years. That's one of those numbers you nod along to until you actually sit with it. Every human civilization that has ever existed, all of recorded history, the pyramids, the emperor, the whole Imperium, all of it fits into a rounding error at the end of that sentence. The Necrons went to sleep long before there was anything on Terra worth mentioning, and they'll wake up to find the galaxy's dominant power is a species that didn't exist when they closed their eyes. Szarekh didn't sleep with them. He left. He took himself out of the galaxy entirely and went into exile. This is where my own reading of him matters most, so take it as that. You can treat Szarekh as an ancient king who wants his empire back, and it works fine. I think that's the shallow version. I read him as the man who made the single worst decision in his species' history, understood exactly what he'd done, and then had to keep existing forever with that knowledge, which is a punishment nobody handed down to him. He chose it. And the worst part is that he succeeded. He was told he could save the Necrontyr from death, and he did. Not one of them has died of old age since. He just didn't understand what he was trading away for it, and he had 60 million years alone to think about that. Am I being generous to him? Probably. But that's how I read the Silent King, and it's why he's still the most interesting character in this whole era for me. And while he was gone, and the Necrons were sealed under their tomb worlds, the galaxy carried on without them. Because somebody survived the war in heaven. The Aeldari came through it, battered and reduced, but still there, and they inherited a galaxy with nothing left in it capable of stopping them. The Old Ones were gone. The Necrons were buried. The C'tan were shards in a box. The Enslaver Plague eventually receded, and what was left was an empty stage and one species standing on it. So the Aeldari rose. And when you look at what they were handed, it isn't hard to see why they rose so far. They had technology inherited from the beings who made them. Psychic ability nothing else in the galaxy could match. The webway to move around in. And more than any of that, they had time. Millions and millions of years of it, with nobody left to take it away from them. Which sounds like the best thing that could ever happen to a civilization. Until you think about what happens to people who have everything for long enough, with nothing to push back against. The things that amazed your ancestors stop registering, and you start looking for something stronger, something you haven't felt before. That's where the next part of this story starts. Because the Aeldari are about to spend millions of years building one of the greatest civilizations the galaxy has ever seen, and then they're going to destroy it themselves, from the inside, without any enemy having to lift a finger. But that's the next video. The Fall of the Aeldari. Slaanesh. The Eye of Terror. The Craft Worlds. The Exodites. The Drukhari. And what happened to a civilization that once held almost the entire galaxy. We'll pick it up there. If you got something out of this one, leave a like and subscribe, because the next one picks up exactly where this stopped. And if I got something wrong, tell me in the comments. Seriously, I'd rather be corrected than confidently wrong for another 10 videos. If you think one of my interpretations doesn't hold up, tell me why. And if you read Szarekh completely differently than I do, that's the comment I actually want to read. Because I'm not sitting here pretending I've got every answer. I'm a fan. Sometimes the lore gives you one clean version, sometimes it gives you 3, and sometimes nobody knows. And that's just where it ends. I'd also like to hear what you want me to cover next, because there's a lot of this era I had to walk past today. But next time, the Aeldari fall, and it gets a lot darker. I'll see you in the next one.